Well, good morning. My name's Chris, and I'm the messenger today. The message doesn't belong to me, but I get to deliver it. So I guess I'm the mailman. So that's my job. I'm a pastor. That's a terrible joke. I'm just seeing if you guys are awake, but if you tell a bad joke, then you still don't know if anyone's awake, right? Because they're all looking at you the same way. Okay, can we start again? Amen. All right, I'm done. I thought there'd be more anticipation since we were left at a cliffhanger in our story in the book of Ruth. So that's where we are. We are in the final chapter of the book of Ruth, and today's message is entitled God Writes the Last Chapter. But before we get into our review, I just want to ask a couple questions. First of all, first question. Have you ever wondered if God has lost control? Maybe not, right? You're like, well, that's kind of a weird thing to wonder. Or you might be going like, yes. I mean, if you're scrolling through the news and it's just bad thing after bad thing. Have you ever had that feeling or that thought come into your mind, that question? Is God actually in control? When you think about the future, is one of the first things that kind of come up is, instead of hope and excitement, it's fear. I think those are pretty common, by the way, if you're thinking that, I'm getting outed here. I'm saying those things because I do that. And here's just some thoughts. One of the things that maybe has even more power in my thought processes and questions, it isn't necessarily the stuff that's going on around me. That just seems to be kind of supporting evidence that God's lost control. It's more of the stuff in my own life. My life doesn't turn out the way I imagined it. When I'm filled with disappointment, but unable to really express it to God, because what I really don't want to admit is that my disappointment is actually with God. And can you be disappointed with God? Does that just sounds weird? And by the way, it's not whether you can, it's whether you admit it, right? But I have a whole talk on that, but that's not for today. But how honest can we be with God when these things crop up? Where do you go? Do you ruminate about the loss of control or the sense of fear that you might have of the future or end times? Or do you maybe do it for a little while and kind of roll it, kind of go, oh, what am I doing? And you give it all to God and start again, only to do that 5 minutes later. You're like, oh no, I'm doing it again. I think even if you aren't there today, I think you've been there at some point in your life. I mean, we even have, like if you look at some of the, I don't know if they're called statistics, but findings through the different generations, there seems to be like generational, like Gen X has a certain fear or a certain thing that's way up high. The boomers have another one, the millennials have another one, and Gen Z, another. Where does it come from? It seems to be like that fear has some incredible power in us. And it must be contagious. As we see it just spread everywhere, right? So that brings me back to this question, is God really in control? And if so, why all the tragedy? Why all the hardship? Why all the pain? Well, it's kind of a downer. Welcome to church if you're visiting. Is this your first time? It's like, what is going on here? Well, life isn't all laughs, and if your vision of church is all these happy people, that's probably not a good vision of church. I mean, it'd be nice, I guess, but it's not realistic. I think more if I was to walk into a church where every single person was just beaming with joy and bouncing, I'd be like, there's some acting going on here, but nobody's having a bad day. Well, in our story in the book of Ruth, that's how the book of Ruth begins. It begins with Naomi lamenting, complaining, wondering where God is, but actually maybe not even wondering. I think more there's this attitude of God's punishing me. And doesn't even say for what. And so she's bitter. She's lost her husband and her 2 sons, and we understand the bitterness and the hardship she's going through because just putting ourselves in that spot. She's in a foreign land, she's lost her husband, then her 2 sons. Like, that's an awful, awful time to try to go through. And so she hears she left her home in Israel, the promised land, to go to Moab to live because there was famine. She hears there's food, she goes back. But she goes back not empty-handed, although that's her complaint. She goes back with her 2 daughters-in-law, but one of them turns back. Ruth, however, stays with Naomi and goes to live with her in Bethlehem. But bitterness fills Naomi, and she even changes her name to Bitter, Mara. Well, in chapter 2, what we have is what do you do when you move to a new place? Sure, there's food there, but you don't have any money. You have no way of getting food. Well, fortunately, through the law, and when God organized the nation of Israel, He gave them all these laws to make sure that the outcast, the poor, the widow, the fatherless, that they were all taken care of. And so they could go and glean in the fields after the harvest and glean everything that was left, and they could use that for food, for survival. And so you have the chapter 2, it's just them surviving. And then you have these statements, it just so happened, as the narrator kind of pulls us into this story, almost giving us this feeling of coincidence, when, of course, when you pull back from the book of Ruth, there's no coincidences here. That God is behind the scenes working, and, the tagline for our whole series is hidden in plain sight. Well, just happens that Ruth goes to this field that's owned by Boaz, who happens to be a relative, and who happens to come up on a conversation between Ruth and his field manager just at the opportune time. Well, it also happens that we find out at the end of chapter 2 that Boaz is a possible kinsman redeemer. He's a relative. And this idea of kinsman redeemer is that, again, God made provision in the law in case misfortune, terrible things happen to a family, that their land, instead of losing it because the husband, maybe all the sons were killed and there's no way to take care of all the stuff back in those days, there was a provision in the law for that, so that the land could stay in the family, as well as the widow could would be married. There's an obligation, actually, of this kinsman redeemer to marry the widow and have children in the line of her previous husband. So that God had made provision for that. And what we see in chapter 2 is we're introduced to Boaz, and we find out at the end he's a kinsman redeemer. And so his kindness and this idea of kinsman redeemer sparks hope in Naomi. So terrible tragedy, chapter 1, spark of hope in chapter 2. And then chapter 3, the love story kicks in. Now we're kind of picking it up in chapter 2, but chapter 3 is, okay, this is what this story is about. And we have Naomi becoming a matchmaker and gives Ruth this entire plan. Ruth says, okay, I'll do it. She goes out and does it, which is incredible courage. I'm not going to preach that sermon. That was last week. You can listen to it on YouTube if you want. It's all there, this whole series. And Ruth proposes to Boaz, incredibly forward. This is like 3,000 years ago, so what? That's, yeah. I mean, it may be fairly normal today, but it wasn't back then. And so Boaz says yes, but there's a snag, and that's where we left off in the story last week, a cliffhanger, because Boaz says, yes, I'll marry you, but there's someone closer than I am, a closer relative. He's the closer one, and so he has the first choice. And so this hope of redemption is like, boom. And Ruth is left with the hope that regardless of whether Boaz is the one who redeems her, that she is going to be redeemed one way or another. Because Boaz says, if he doesn't, I will. But for the reader, we're into the love story, right? We're already really liking Boaz and Ruth as a couple. And so it's like, oh no, this other guy, surely not, right? I'm sure none of you read ahead. And so it'll be a surprise for all of us. So let's get into it. We're going to read chapter 4, and let's see what happens. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, behold, and so it happened. Oh, just happened to walk by at that time. Okay. And Boaz said, turn aside, friend. Sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. So they know something's brewing here. Look, something's going on. It's calling people together. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of these people here and in the presence of the elders of my people. Boaz is a smart dude. Doesn't give the whole story yet, right? Then he continues, if you will redeem it, redeem it. If you will not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. More tension in the story, right? What? No, Boaz. Come on, Boaz, do something. No, this is what he does. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite. Notice he made sure, it didn't just say Ruth, her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. We're gonna explain that a little bit in a few minutes. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. And all the readers will go like, yes. Guess what? It is gonna be Ruth and Boaz after all. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. Kind of gross, but I guess it works for them, right? So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Mahlon, by the way, was Ruth's husband. Also, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah." By the way, we're wives of Jacob, which is an ancestor going back. Jacob was actually renamed by God Israel, so that's where the nation of Israel comes from. And Rachel and Leah were his wives, who built up together the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Epaphra and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez. Now, Perez was a relative of an ancestor of Boaz, as we find actually at the end of the book. And the significance there is there's an interesting story there about Judah, who was the father of Perez, and this exact custom about marrying. So Judah had sons, and daughter-in-laws, of course. One of his sons dies. Daughter-in-law is supposed to marry the oldest son, but Judah doesn't want it to happen. And so the whole story is like really twisted. But you can read it. It's in the book of Genesis, Judah and Tamar. But Perez ends up being the son who Judah and Tamar have together. Yeah, there you go. That's the twisted plot given away there. And so that's what's being referred to, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because the offspring that the Lord will give you by this woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the name of the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you," and this is quite a statement, especially for these days, "who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered... So if you say these things fast enough, it sounds like you know what you're talking about and how to pronounce them. I totally don't, so... Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David. And that's how the book and the story ends. Kind of an odd ending for a love story, but we'll figure it out, I think. All right, so I just want to go through the story really quickly. We don't have as much time today to delve into as there's so much in that last chapter. I'm like, oh man, we're going to have to breeze through some of it. Here's where I want to go. We'll kind of recap the story a little bit, and then I want to kind of go into this idea of God's hidden hand that we've seen in the book of Ruth, and then glimpses of the gospel before our final takeaways. So that's the plan. So here we go. So first part is man on a mission, right? I mean, Boaz is definitely, like, he is determined. He is like, he's at the gate. He's ready to do business. He's waiting for this dude to come through. And sure enough, it so happens that he does. And Naomi's right. At the end of the chapter 3, she says that Boaz won't rest until the matter of redemption is settled, until this matter is settled today, she said. Like, he is determined. And I think she kind of captured that by the massive gift that Boaz sent back with Ruth. And so what we have here, I think, is a really encouraging picture of God's determination in redemption. Right? This determination that Boaz has, it's a reflection. It's a reflection of how determined God is when it comes to redemption. That he will not rest until the matter is settled. And we see this determination in God. And he's driven by his love. right? Which is what we see with Boaz, right? Driven by his love for Ruth, which we discovered. We didn't know it was there. He thought he was out of the running in the previous chapter, and then he's like, oh, wow, I guess I'm not. I'm in. And we see God's determination and his incredible love driving him in redemption. And it's not because we're so redeemable. It's not because we're such great people. It's actually God's heart and his love for us that drives him and gives him that determination that redemption needs to happen. We see Boaz calling for the witnesses, and this was kind of, in their day, this would have been like the court scene. 10 is an important number in the Old Testament. And there's a few things that it represents. One of them is perfection or order, like order from chaos, and a number of other things. But it's just like 10. You'll notice actually there's 10 generations from Perez to David. There's a lot of 10s here. I don't have time to go in that. You can investigate it later on your own. So Boaz presses the relative to make a choice. So this is what we see, right? So he gets everybody together and he's pressing them. And masterful job by Boaz. You know, he knows that his relative is able to purchase the land, right? So he knows that his relative is wealthy. He's not shocked when the relative says, oh yeah, I'll buy it. His heart didn't fall into his shoes. Boaz knows what's going on here. And he knows that his relative is very wealthy and can afford to purchase the land. And so the man accepts immediately, right? But backs out after counting the cost, because it isn't just about him purchasing the land with money. He has to marry Ruth. And so there's two big things here. One's a probability. The other one is obvious because he says it. The probability is that as Ruth as a Moabite, who the Moabites were looked down on, the whole race of people was started through incest. You actually can find that in Genesis, that story with Lot and his daughters. But they were looked down on. They were also worshipers of some really awful, terrible gods. And again, I really want to, it's very interesting, but we can't go there today. And so, but being a Moabite, for me, that's like for this guy, that's strike one. Like, maybe that's 3 strikes, I don't know. But that definitely would have played a part. And again, remember that Ruth isn't mentioned just as Ruth, because we know who she is at chapter 4, right? It doesn't have to say the Moabite, and yet it's in the text, and it continually says it. So the man's backs out. And here's the wrinkle, is that if he marries Ruth, he has to use his children's inheritance money, like his money would have been their inheritance. He would have to use that money to purchase the land. Now, he probably would have made money from it and all that, but it would have been like a huge amount. And so he would have been taking away his children's inheritance, because the land that he would redeem wouldn't belong to his children, his current children. They would belong to the children born by Ruth. And so his children at this point would get none of it, and their inheritance would be used to purchase someone else's inheritance. So you kind of catching it? So he's going, this is him counting the cost, going like, nah, maybe not. And so it's interesting. This is just kind of a sidebar, and I don't have time to delve into it, but the kinsman, the closest one, he's nameless. It never says his name. And this story, all the names have so much meaning, and they're so important in the story. And he remains nameless to this day. Counted the cost and decided against it, and so we don't even know who he was. Boaz, however, we're talking about him today, 3,000 years later. It's pretty incredible. He seals the deal, redeems the land and the family line by marrying Ruth. And again, we need to understand how costly this venture would have been for Boaz. If he had children already, then he's using same thing. He's using their inheritance to purchase and redeem this land and to marry Ruth. And it would belong to Ruth's offspring. All right. The second thing is we have this blushing bride. So we have the fulfillment of a love story. Had it not been Boaz marrying Ruth, we couldn't have really, well, I guess we could call it a love story. It would have been more like Shakespeare's love stories, maybe, Romeo and Juliet. If you haven't read it, or sorry for the spoiler, they don't make it. So a tragedy, but it isn't. It is truly this love story, and God behind the scenes. They're married, and the promise of redemption we see is fulfilled. The hope that started in chapter 2 and grew right into chapter 4 is now seen fulfilled in the marriage to Boaz. And so they give birth to a son, Obed, which means servant, probably short for Obadiah, which means servant of the Lord, signifying God's blessing on them and the clear reversal from the emptiness and bitterness in chapter 1 to joy and blessing in chapter 4. And so what we have is 3 funerals in chapter 1 and a wedding in chapter 4. And this is the stark difference from death to life. So that's our short recap of chapter 4. Now, let's dive into this idea of God's hidden hand of God. Because I think as we've gone through this story, there's some things we need to pull out kind of on the macro level that are really important. And I think these are all takeaways for us, even though we have some specific takeaways. I think they all are. And so we see the hidden hand of God. The narrator shows how the chance meeting of 2 people brought together through highly unlikely circumstances become the ancestors of King David, through whom the Messiah would come. This is why the genealogy is at the end. And so the story of Ruth is this bridge between the time of the judges and the establishment of a king and kingdom, right? And so at the end of Judges, you have this, in those days, there was no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's how Judges ends, and that verse is repeated throughout the book of Judges. Well, Ruth fills in the gap, because the next book after Ruth is 1 Samuel. And in 1 Samuel, the people eventually get a king. Now, it's not David yet. They get King Saul first, David second. But this whole thing, this establishment of a king and kingdom, is revealing God's hidden work behind the scenes as he moves history along to fulfill his redemptive plan. So you've heard of the kingdom of God. If you've read any of the Gospels, like this is on repeat, the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. Jesus proclaiming the kingdom of God. Well, we draw back into Ruth and go like, this is where this was getting some traction. We see God behind the scenes moving history along towards a kingdom. And the story reveals, and this is really good news for those of us here, God's intention is to redeem all people, both Jew and Gentile, meaning both Jew and non-Jew. Right? And so we're a long ways from Israel from here. And so you might have some Jewish heritage. That's great. But for most of us, I think no, we don't. But God's heart is revealed in the book of Ruth. Ruth is a Gentile. She doesn't belong to Israel. And yet, we see salvation and redemption for her. And not only that, she's in the line of King David, who is in the line of the eventual Messiah who would come, named Jesus. So that's what we're supposed to see at the end of the story. We're supposed to see God's hidden hand. That's the genealogy kind of exposes that, going like, oh, so God's at work all the time in every generation. He's been working this whole time. And then the thought is, oh, that means he's not just working now. Oh, he's working into the future. And so here's a few glimpses of the gospel that we get through the end of the story. The first one is redemption is costly. The Redeemer must shoulder the entire cost and do all the work necessary. Right? Boaz had to do everything. At that point, when he said yes, it was up to him. He had to do the work. He had to pay the price. Ruth had nothing. Like literally, she was like poor and destitute, had absolutely nothing. The only thing she had was the grain that Boaz had given her. That's all she had. And so the cost of redeeming the land was far beyond what Ruth or Naomi, because neither of them had anything, could pay. This is like our debt. Our debt and bondage to sin and death is far beyond our ability to pay. We can't pay it off. We can't kind of slough it off or push it to the side by saying, well, I'm a good person. Well, that's great. But you still need redeeming. Because this is the situation, and the story of Ruth shows us this is the situation you're in, is that you need redemption. You need a redeemer. Because the cost is too high for you to pay. And the Bible tells us that the wages of sin is death. That's the cost? Oh, okay. So being a good person doesn't quite pay for that. And we see what Boaz weighing the cost, right? This great cost. It's going to cost a life for redemption for us. But we see this in Boaz. He weighs the cost and chooses to redeem Ruth and Naomi, just like Jesus weighed the cost for us, for our redemption, chose to pay it out of his free will, his love, driven by his love and his obedience. Like, that's the picture we have of redemption when it comes to both Boaz and what he did, and God. He counted the cost and said, it's worth it. You're worth it. And so God sent his son. He became one of us. And the cost was as high as it can get, that he would give his only son so that we could have life and so that we could be rescued from sin and death. That's what Jesus did for us in redemption. Well, secondly, it's the opposite. Redemption is costly for the Redeemer, but redemption is a free gift for the one being redeemed. In fact, it can only be that. Ruth could only accept Boaz's redeeming work as a gift of grace. Right? She didn't go to the gate with him to try to convince people. She didn't have, once Boaz had said yes and redemption was about to happen, it had to be Boaz. Ruth had nothing to offer in that area. She couldn't pay. She didn't have anything. And so she had to accept it as a gift of grace. Just like we, in the same way, can only accept God's work, his redeeming work, as a gift. It's a gift of grace and mercy. He did all the work. He paid the cost. And he did it willingly. And so redemption can't be earned. It can only be received with gladness, thankfulness, and joy. And we learned last week, our role is repentance and submission to his will. That's what we need to do. That's part of the laying down on the feet in chapter 3. And our last glimpse here is that not everyone qualifies to be a redeemer. Not anybody could. Right? So the first guy, he did, except in one area. He wasn't willing. And so Boaz is qualified because he's a relative of Naomi, was able to pay the costly price. So the first redeemer had those two things. But he was not willing to do it, Boaz was. Well, Jesus is qualified because he became one of us, became a relative, was able to pay the price, his blood, his life, and was willing to do it because of love and obedience. This is what the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 2. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement, that's the covering, for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Okay. So today, what are our takeaways? I think there's 3 takeaways, and I don't think we need to dwell long on them. I think we just need, it's more of a, we've got to remember these things, because most of them are from the book as a whole, not just chapter 4. So our first one is that hidden hand of God. And here's what we learn from chapter 1 to chapter 4. Resentment, bitterness, and focusing on our circumstances blinds us from seeing God and his work in our lives, from seeing his blessing. It actually hides what God is doing, the work of his hand and his blessing in plain sight. So we have is Naomi. She's bitter, angry, full of resentment, thinking she's full of despair. And the whole time, Ruth is with her. Right? And she doesn't recognize the blessing until later. As her eyes are opened, she sees the blessing that was there the whole time. That Ruth had been with her since the beginning of the story. And Ruth is one of the most incredible women, like in all of Scripture. It's awesome. In fact, little side note, in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth comes after Proverbs 30, after the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs 31 asked, a woman of noble character, who can find? Well, Ruth follows Proverbs in the Hebrew order of things. Interesting, right? But that bitterness and that resentment, it blinds us. Have you let that build up in your life? Like, if I could encourage you, if there is resentment building up, do not let it build any longer. Resentment is a killer. Bitterness is poison to your own soul. And it causes you blindness. If you have built up resentment, you cannot see. Because it's like it's put on this lens that all you see is everything that comes through the bitterness and resentment. That's how you interpret everything. Well, the remedy to that is forgiveness. Not allowing resentment and bitterness to build, but forgiving. And we're gonna do communion here in a couple minutes. If you have resentment, bitterness building in your life, you need to take care of it. In fact, probably before we have communion, that's probably a good chance. Give it to God. If you need to confess to somebody or forgive someone, do it. It's a great opportunity. So forgiveness, giving our disappointments and pain to God, and adjusting our attitude to one of thankfulness brings into focus the kindness, blessing, and loving presence of God in our lives. So this is the antidote. One of them causes blindness, and one of them gives us sight. And so the question, do you want to walk in blindness? Are you just happy with that because you want to hold on to that resentment? Or are you willing to give it up? And then see the blessing that maybe is right in front of you, that you were unable to see. So God is at work and intricately involved in your day-to-day life. But are you willing to look for him? Because it does require that you give up on the resentment, that you let it go. You surrender it and offer forgiveness. Our second takeaway is, which chapter do you find yourself in? This story is day-to-day stuff. It is day-to-day living. All these emotions we've all experienced. We've had to come up with, we've had terrible times, we've had good times, we've had joy, we've had pain. Has life been hard? Have you wondered where God is in your life and circumstances? These are very personal questions, by the way. I didn't just come up with them. I'm like, what am I dealing with? On a regular basis, I have to readjust. Because I have asked so many times, God, where are you? This I can't see. Have you allowed bitterness and resentment to build up? Back into the book of Hebrews, the writer says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. There's this great warning against bitterness. So we can build resentment, or the root, like the imagery there. You use root, as roots grow, right? And they get harder to pull as they grow. I know that because I'm trying to get them out of my lawn and my garden, like constantly. But the bigger they get, the deeper the root goes, the harder they are to get out. So that's kind of chapter 1. Chapter 2 are small glimpses of God's presence and work in your life beginning to happen. Have you kind of made that adjustment, trying to be more aware of God in your day-to-day life? Is there a small seed of hope maybe growing in you? Chapter 3, there's a lot there, but I'm just going to sum it up in one question. Have you entrusted your life fully to God? The picture of Ruth laying herself down at Boaz's feet. A picture of like complete submission, and I'm giving myself completely to you. I'm laying myself down. Whatever Boaz does at this point, like Ruth is at his mercy. If he's offended, or if he's just kind of like, what are you doing here? This is not why I was being kind to you. So it's a little bit risky, right? And yet we know the character of the one, the Redeemer, that we lay ourselves down to. It's Jesus. Who else could you entrust your life to? Like yourself? I've tried to do that lots. Terrible outcomes. We need a Redeemer. That's because deep inside, we know we need a Redeemer. And finally, chapter 4, are you consistently seeing his sustaining presence and work in your life as you intentionally look for him? I see this is the progression through this book, from blindness to complete sight. That all of a sudden, there's this blessing everywhere. It's not that it didn't exist before. It's that specifically Naomi, her eyes have been opened. And then there's blessing all around her. And finally, the last takeaway is the title. God writes the last chapter. See, the characters fade, right? It says, as it goes on, like Ruth doesn't say anything after chapter 3. Like the people that we would consider the main characters are fading away. And they give way to the main character. So the writer has done a masterful job. He's pulled us into this love story. But as the love story finishes, it's not the end of the story. It's meant to show us that it's just part of a bigger, far longer story as he concludes with the genealogy. Because it's not the story of Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, and it is, but it isn't. It's God's story. He's the hero. He is the main character as he moves history along according to his redemptive plan. So no matter where we find ourselves, we can place ourselves at the feet of Jesus, knowing that he is trustworthy and that the hope of redemption can be a powerful force in our lives. God writes the last chapter. That's your life too. As our life fades, what becomes more and more evident is God. He's the main player as he continues, generation after generation, to fulfill his redemptive plan. And so we can give our fears, worries, and future, especially the worries about the future, to Jesus, knowing that he is good, trustworthy, and closer to you than you could ever imagine. And I want to finish with this quote. It's from Warren Wiersbe. Not all of life's stories have this kind of happy ending. But this little book reminds us that for Christians, God still writes the last chapter. We don't have to be afraid of the future. Let's pray.